Between 1985 and 1992, a quiet rural county in Virginia was struck by a series of deaths that, at first glance, seemed like nothing more than cruel twists of fate. Neighbors spoke of violent stomach cramps, relentless vomiting, and sudden collapses. That led to agonizing deaths within days. The victims were not connected by blood or business, but they shared one unsettling common link: an unassuming middle-aged woman named Linda Johnson. She was known in her community as a caring figure, the type of woman who would sit in the front pew on Sunday mornings, bring food to the sick, and offer to pray with anyone who looked burdened. When the first deaths occurred, doctors were quick to attribute them to heart failure, food poisoning, or natural illness. Nothing seemed suspicious. After all, this was a part of Virginia where small farming communities thrived on faith, family, and a belief that evil was something that happened elsewhere. People trusted their neighbors, as if trust itself was a form of currency. In such a place, the idea that a woman like Linda could be behind such suffering was beyond imagination. But by the summer of 1992, that trust was shattered. A 59-year-old tobacco farmer named Charles Harris collapsed suddenly at a revival service. Unlike others before him, his family refused to accept the same tired explanations. They demanded answers, pressing for an autopsy that would uncover a truth more chilling than anyone could have anticipated. What lay hidden beneath Linda Johnson's mask of faith and compassion would soon expose her as one of the most dangerous predators her community had ever seen. The Virginia of the 1980s was still a place where traditions ran deep. In counties like Amelia and Powhatan, church was the center of life. People gathered not only to worship, but to trade news, strengthen bonds, and offer mutual support. In such communities, women like Linda played vital roles. They volunteered to help the elderly, cooked meals for funerals, and carried themselves as models of Christian devotion. This image made her untouchable in the eyes of her neighbors. She was the woman you trusted with your children, the one who would stop by your porch just to ask if you needed anything. But trust is often the most dangerous weapon in the hands of someone who knows how to exploit it. Investigators would later uncover that Linda Johnson had turned an ordinary household item, rat poison, into her tool of choice. With careful precision, she laced meals and drinks with doses too small to raise immediate alarm, but deadly enough to guarantee suffering and eventual death. To those around her, she was a caregiver. To those who truly saw the pattern, she was a predator disguised as a saint. The story of Linda Johnson begins long before the deaths that shook her community. Born in 1943 in a modest farmhouse near Farmville, Virginia, she was the second of 9 children. Her parents were strict Pentecostals, raising their children with unyielding rules of faith, modesty, and obedience. Their home, like many others in the area, had no running water or electricity during Linda's early years. Daily life was filled with hardship, but also with a strong sense of community. Families helped one another during harvest, neighbors left doors unlocked, and faith was considered more binding than law. As a child, Linda showed signs of both intelligence and discipline. Teachers praised her for her sharp reading skills and willingness to help classmates who struggled. She rarely got into trouble and was seen as quiet, obedient, and thoughtful. Yet behind that reserved exterior, she carried the burden of being the eldest daughter in a large family. Responsibility came early, caring for younger siblings, cooking meals, and managing chores that left little room for childhood freedoms. During her teenage years, Linda discovered a rare source of joy: basketball. At Farmville High, she surprised everyone with her quick reflexes and strategic thinking on the court. It gave her a sense of independence she had never known. But that independence was short-lived. When her mother gave birth to twins, Linda was forced to give up the game she loved. Her family needed her at home and in her household duty always came before desire. It was during these years of sacrifice that Linda met Robert Johnson, a tall, good-natured boy, a year older than her. He was not striking in appearance, but he treated her with a kindness that set him apart from her father's strict hand and harsh words. Their courtship was quiet and constrained by her father's strict rules, but their affection deepened with each stolen moment at school or church. By the time she turned 17, Linda saw marriage as her only way out of the suffocating life at home. She and Robert eloped in a modest courthouse ceremony, beginning what she believed would be a new chapter filled with freedom and love. For a time, it was. The couple moved into a small farmhouse of their own, and Linda poured herself into creating a home she could finally call hers. The early years of their marriage were filled with hope, shared dreams, and the determination to create a family better than the ones they had known as children. But life has a way of twisting those dreams. In the late 1960s, Robert was injured in a serious car accident that left him with chronic pain and an inability to work consistently. He turned to alcohol to dull the agony, a decision that placed strain on both his body and their marriage. Linda, raised to see alcohol as a sin, grew resentful and controlling. Their once loving home turned into a battleground of mistrust, resentment, and arguments. In 1969, Robert was found dead in a house fire. Officials ruled it an accident caused, they said, by him falling asleep with a cigarette. Linda wept openly at his funeral, collapsing in grief as neighbors comforted her. The community saw her as an unfortunate widow, struck by tragedy. But quietly, some wondered why she had taken her children out of the house that very night, leaving Robert behind. Others noticed that she had removed family photographs and important papers days before the fire. These whispers never grew into accusations, but they lingered in the shadows, waiting to resurface years later. For Linda, widowhood brought more than sorrow. It brought opportunity. Insurance money and donations from sympathetic neighbors gave her financial stability she had never known. To the community, she was still the grieving mother doing her best to raise her children. To Linda, the fire had revealed something darker. That death, when orchestrated carefully, could erase problems, secure resources, and even generate sympathy. It was the beginning of a pattern that would stretch on for years, leaving behind a trail of bodies no one dared to question. As the 1970s and 80s unfolded, Linda Johnson perfected her performance as a caregiver, a role that allowed her to get close to the vulnerable and unsuspecting. Whether through new relationships or her work caring for the elderly, she positioned herself as a trusted presence. Each time suspicion might have threatened her carefully crafted image, tragedy would strike, and another person would be gone taken by what doctors called natural causes, but what investigators would later expose as deliberate, cold-blooded poisonings. By the time Charles Harris collapsed in 1992, Linda's quiet killings had spanned nearly 2 decades. To the outside world, she was still the soft-spoken woman with a Bible in her hand and a gentle smile on her face. Inside, she had become something far more sinister, an architect of suffering who thrived on the trust of others. The mask was still in place, but cracks were beginning to show. The fire that claimed Robert Johnson's life in 1969 marked more than the tragic end of a young husband. It was the birth of a new life for Linda. Overnight, she shifted from being a struggling wife, tethered to an ailing, bitter man, to a grieving widow wrapped in the sympathy of her community. Neighbors brought casseroles and home-baked pies. Church members raised money to help her rebuild, and even distant relatives sent envelopes of cash tucked inside letters filled with words of sorrow. On the outside, Linda seemed broken and lost. Inside, she had discovered a disturbing truth that misfortune could be turned into power, and tragedy could be orchestrated to work in her favor. For a time, she played the role of widow flawlessly. Her children were dressed neatly for church. She volunteered for community events, and she embodied the image of a mother determined to rise above adversity. Yet those who paid closer attention noticed her life improving in ways unexpected for someone recently devastated by loss. She bought a modest new home near her parents, paid off debts that had once seemed insurmountable, and carried herself with a confidence that had not been visible before. Where others saw resilience, Linda was practicing calculation. Her next relationship came swiftly with a man named Edward Barnes, a widower in his early 40s who owned several acres of farmland and a small but successful produce business. Edward was respected in Amelia County for his work ethic and his generosity. He had raised children on his own after losing his wife, and many considered him a pillar of his church. When he began courting Linda, people whispered that it was a match made in heaven. She was a devoted mother, and he was a man of means and stability. The idea of the two joining households promised security, companionship, and hope. From the beginning, Linda pursued Edward with unusual intensity. She baked pies for him, attended every community gathering where she knew he would be, and charmed his children with gentle words and small gifts. To Edward, she seemed like a blessing, a woman who could bring warmth back into a house that had felt empty for years. By the summer of 1970, just a little over a year after Robert's death, the two were married in a modest ceremony surrounded by family and friends. For a time, their marriage appeared idyllic. Linda managed the household with meticulous care. She kept Edward's books organized, helped with correspondence for his farm business, and ensured his children had everything they needed. She seemed to embody the role of the perfect wife. But beneath this polished exterior, dangerous cracks had already begun to spread. Linda's reliance on prescription medications had begun quietly during her marriage to Robert, when stress and sleepless nights led her doctor to prescribe tranquilizers. By the time she married Edward, her tolerance had grown, and she sought out multiple physicians in neighboring towns to keep herself supplied. Pills became her comfort, her crutch, and eventually her obsession. To feed her habit, she needed more money than Edward allotted her. At first, she stole small amounts, forging checks with practiced precision. But her appetite for both drugs and cash soon outgrew the careful tricks she had once relied upon. Edward noticed the missing money. A man who had always been cautious. With his finances, he began questioning bank statements and pointing out irregularities. Linda's explanations were rehearsed, but increasingly flimsy. At first, he wanted to believe her after all. She was his wife, and trust was supposed to be the bedrock of marriage. But suspicion grew heavier with each unanswered question. By early 1971, he had confronted her directly, accusing her of theft and deceit. For Linda, the confrontation was more than uncomfortable. It was dangerous. If Edward pursued divorce or pressed charges, her carefully constructed image would collapse. She would lose not only financial security, but also the protective mask she had worn so effectively in her community. Divorce carried stigma, exposure, carried consequences, and Linda had already tasted the power of a more permanent solution. One evening in March 1971, Edward complained of sudden, intense stomach pains after dinner. He dismissed it as food poisoning, but the pain grew unbearable, and by nightfall he was vomiting violently. Linda was at his side, praying aloud and preparing broths she claimed would soothe his stomach. To the outside eye, she was the picture of a devoted wife. But the carefully prepared meals she fed him contained something far more sinister than comfort. Within hours, Edward's condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors who examined him noted elevated white blood cell counts, but found no infection to explain the severity of his illness. His heart struggled under the strain. His blood pressure dropped, and despite every effort to stabilize him, Edward Barnes died before dawn. The diagnosis: acute heart failure, brought on by a mysterious gastric illness. At the funeral, Linda wept uncontrollably, fainting more than once as friends rushed to her side. Her grief was convincing, her devotion beyond question. Once again, she played the part of the devastated widow with flawless precision. No one dared suspect the truth that she had turned poison into her most reliable weapon, and death into a financial and personal strategy. Edward's death left her wealthier than she had ever been. Insurance policies, property holdings, and savings fell into her lap. With her new financial freedom, Linda bought a larger home and secured her children's schooling. To neighbors, she was simply a woman who had endured unimaginable loss, but was determined to carry on. To Linda, it was confirmation that her method worked, and that suspicion could be managed as long as she performed grief convincingly. Her methods grew more refined. Unlike the fire that had killed Robert, Edward's death required no staged accident, no destruction of property. It was clean, quiet, and appeared entirely natural. The precision with which she timed her poisoning just after Edward discovered her theft was chilling evidence of her evolving craft. What had once been an act of desperation was now becoming a system, one she would repeat with increasing confidence. As the years passed, Linda's circle of victims expanded. Family members, elderly neighbors, and even those who saw her as a caregiver would fall ill under her watch. The symptoms were always the same: crippling stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, followed by collapse and eventual death. Each time, Linda appeared at their bedside with prayers on her lips and worry in her eyes. Each time she walked away with sympathy, sometimes with money, and always with a reputation that grew stronger instead of weaker. But shadows were gathering behind her carefully maintained smile. A few relatives whispered that it was strange how misfortune followed her. Others noted that she seemed to have financial luck after each tragedy. These whispers were small and easily dismissed in a place where gossip was common and trust was a way of life. Yet for all her confidence, Linda knew she was walking a dangerous line. The more lives she touched, the greater the chance someone might finally connect the pattern. Still, she could not stop. For Linda Johnson, trust had become her most valuable resource, and betrayal her most effective weapon. With every death, she sharpened her skill, confident that her mask of faith and kindness would always protect her. But masks, no matter how carefully worn, eventually begin to crack. By the mid-1970s, Linda Johnson had built a reputation that few in her county dared to question. To outsiders, she was a woman twice widowed, a survivor of cruel fate who carried her burdens with remarkable strength. Neighbors praised her faith, her devotion to her children, and her willingness to help others in need. Yet behind the curtains of her home, the reality was far more sinister. Her dependency on prescription pills had deepened into a quiet addiction, and her appetite for money to fund that habit was growing by the month. It was during this period that Linda moved closer to her aging parents. On the surface, it looked like an act of love and duty. Her father was already in failing health, and her mother, Margaret Johnson, was beginning to struggle with the daily demands of life. Linda's siblings admired her willingness to step in, calling her the most responsible of the children. They saw her as the one who could be counted on to sacrifice her own comfort for the sake of family. In truth, Linda was positioning herself in the perfect place where trust, dependence, and opportunity overlapped. Her father's death came quickly, the result of lung cancer that had ravaged his body for years. For once, Linda didn't need to interfere. Nature had already done the work. But Margaret, at 74, was different. She lived on a modest pension, carefully managed savings, and a few insurance policies that offered security for her final years. She was cautious with her money, and in her frailty, she began relying more heavily on Linda to handle banking, bills, and household expenses. This arrangement gave Linda exactly what she wanted: access. She learned her mother's handwriting, memorized account numbers, and began siphoning funds in small amounts that Margaret would never notice. At first, it was $20 or $30 explained as cash withdrawals for groceries or medicine. But as Linda's need for drugs and spending grew, the thefts became larger and harder to conceal. To cover her tracks, Linda turned to the same strategy she had perfected with Edward: manipulation through caregiving. She prepared meals for her mother, read scripture at her bedside, and convinced the elderly woman that her health was faltering more quickly than it truly was. Whenever Margaret experienced unexplained weakness or stomach troubles, Linda was there, spooning broth into her mouth and whispering prayers. These episodes of illness became more frequent, and each time doctors were called, they were baffled. The symptoms pointed to gastroenteritis or food poisoning, but nothing conclusive appeared in blood tests. Margaret would suffer for days, then mysteriously recover, only to fall ill again weeks later. What no one realized was that Linda was experimenting, testing doses of poison to measure their effects. Her mother had become a living experiment in her growing mastery of a deadly craft. The emotional toll on Margaret was heavy. Once a proud, independent woman, she now found herself weak, dependent, and increasingly frightened by the unpredictability of her health. Linda used this vulnerability to strengthen her control. She convinced her mother to let her manage all household finances, warned her not to worry herself with complex paperwork, and even persuaded her to hand over important documents for safekeeping. Each step tightened the net of dependence, leaving Margaret powerless to see the danger in her daughter's hands. But as Linda escalated her thefts, suspicion stirred. Margaret began asking quiet questions about checks she didn't remember writing, about withdrawals that seemed larger than necessary. Her voice carried no accusation, only confusion, but for Linda, even the hint of discovery was intolerable. She knew her mother's savings would soon be reviewed by banks at the end of the year. The discrepancies would surface, and questions would follow. So, in December of 1974, during what should have been a peaceful holiday season, Margaret suffered the worst episode yet. Cramping tore through her stomach, vomiting left her gasping for breath, and dehydration set in swiftly. Linda acted the part of the dutiful daughter, rushing her to the hospital and holding her hand while doctors scrambled for answers. Despite every effort, Margaret's condition worsened, and within 2 days she was gone. The official cause of death was listed as complications from acute gastroenteritis. Friends and family mourned deeply, praising Linda for her devotion and calling her a saint for caring so tenderly during her mother's final days. No one questioned the timing. No one looked for patterns. And once again, Linda walked away not only with sympathy, but with financial gain, inheritance, insurance, and complete freedom from the threat of discovery. What shocked investigators years later was not simply that Linda had killed her own mother, but how meticulously she had carried it out. She had rehearsed her methods, refined her dosage, and executed the plan without hesitation. Poison had become her solution, a silent and invisible weapon that left no trace of violence, only grief. Margaret's death gave Linda a new kind of confidence. If she could kill her own mother without raising suspicion, who could possibly stop her? Her siblings never suspected. Her community only admired her strength, and doctors chalked up the death to illness. The ease with which she had executed this crime convinced her that she was untouchable. But confidence can be dangerous. With each successful murder, Linda grew bolder. She began forging checks more openly, stealing in larger sums, and manipulating those around her with less caution. The mask of the saintly caregiver was still in place, but behind it, she was beginning to slip. Around this time, Linda entered a relationship with James Parker, a local businessman whose wife had died the year before. James was cautious by nature, But Linda's reputation preceded her. Everyone spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her ability to endure hardship without complaint. For James, she seemed like a gift, a woman who could bring stability back into his lonely life. Their relationship blossomed, and within months, marriage was on the horizon. But before that future could take shape, James was killed in a sudden car accident. The crash baffled investigators. James had always been a careful driver, yet he had veered off a dry, straight road into a tree. Toxicology tests were not performed, and the accident was written off as tragic misfortune. For Linda, it was another clean escape, though she did not profit financially, as she had from her husband and mother. James's death served a different purpose. It removed a man who had started to ask uncomfortable questions about her finances. By the time the decade closed, Linda Johnson had mastered her dual identity. To the world, she was the endlessly unfortunate. Woman first a widow, then a grieving daughter, then a companion robbed of love yet again. But beneath the veil of tragedy, she was a predator honing her method, leaving behind a trail of bodies that no one dared to connect. Her strength came not from physical force or threats, but from the very things that made her appear trustworthy. She was a woman, a mother, a caregiver, and a Christian. In her community, those roles were untouchable. Few could imagine that a woman with a Bible in her hand and a gentle smile could harbor such darkness. And so Linda continued, convinced that her path was clear, her secret safe, and her method perfected. But history has a way of catching up with those who believe themselves invincible. Linda's pattern of death had gone unnoticed for nearly a decade, but every crime leaves behind shadows, and every mask eventually begins to slip. By the mid-1980s, Linda Johnson's reputation had grown beyond that of a twice-widowed survivor. She was now seen as a pillar of Christian devotion, a woman who carried grief with dignity and poured her energy into helping others. Neighbors called on her when an elderly relative needed care. Pastors praised her devotion, and friends trusted her to watch over their children. To everyone who knew her, Linda was the embodiment of compassion. But in truth, her caregiving was a cloak, one that allowed her to get closer to her victims than anyone else ever could. Her drug dependency had not slowed. By now, it consumed nearly every part of her life. Prescription pills were no longer a comfort. They were a necessity. To maintain her habit, she needed steady money, and caregiving provided both income and access to the vulnerable. It was the perfect cover. No one questioned a woman who dedicated her life to looking after the sick and the elderly. In 1986, Linda was hired to care for George and Martha Edwards, an elderly couple in their 90s who lived just outside Farmville. George was frail but still sharp, while Martha had broken her leg and needed daily assistance. Their children lived far away, visiting only occasionally, and they felt reassured leaving their parents in Linda's hands. She arrived each morning with a Bible tucked under her arm, humming hymns as she prepared meals and cleaned their home. To the Edwards family, Linda was a blessing. She ensured their bills were paid, kept the house orderly, and even managed their medications. But in reality, she was studying their finances, memorizing account numbers, and forging checks with the same practiced hand she had used before. Her thefts were cautious at first, small amounts that could be explained away. But as her confidence grew, so did the sums. George never questioned the missing money. At his age, he often forgot transactions, and when he noticed discrepancies, Linda reassured him with her gentle voice. Martha, however, began to notice. Even with her limited mobility, she spotted checks she didn't recall signing and bills she couldn't understand. Her confusion worried her, but she trusted Linda too much to believe the worst. George's death in early 1987 came as no surprise. At 94, his passing was attributed to age and failing health. Linda was praised for her devotion during his final days, and the Edwards family insisted she continue caring for Martha. But within weeks, Martha too began suffering from sudden stomach pains, nausea, and violent vomiting. Linda stayed by her side, offering prayers, teas, and broths. The elderly woman deteriorated rapidly, and before long she was gone as well. Doctors listed her death as complications from illness, and once again, Linda's performance as the grieving caregiver was flawless. The Edwards children, far removed from their parents' daily lives, were grateful rather than suspicious. At the funeral, they spoke about how fortunate their parents had been to have Linda in their last months. No one suspected that Martha's growing questions about missing funds had sealed her fate. Linda's work with the Edwards family enhanced her reputation. Other families now sought her out, certain that she was a woman of rare devotion. Soon after, she was employed by Henry and Rebecca Lee, another elderly couple in need of help. Henry was 80 and suffered from mild confusion. W.A.L. Lee Rebecca was recovering from an injury that left her dependent on others. Linda slipped seamlessly into their lives. She managed medications, cooked meals, and kept financial records. Once again, she began her quiet thefts, writing checks in Henry's name and pocketing the money. But unlike George Edwards, Henry was sharper, more attentive. He noticed when bank statements didn't match his records and began asking Linda pointed questions. For Linda, suspicion was always a threat that demanded elimination. By June of 1987, Henry was struck by the same violent illness that had claimed Martha. His stomach pains were unbearable, his body weakened by vomiting and dehydration. Despite hospital care, he was gone within 48 hours. The death was written off as natural, his age making the explanation plausible. Rebecca, devastated by the loss of her husband, leaned heavily on Linda for comfort. She praised her caregiver's dedication, never realizing she was living under the same shadow that had consumed her husband. The Lee family, like the Edwards before them, saw Linda as a savior rather than a suspect. In their eyes, she was a woman surrounded by misfortune, yet still devoted enough to serve others with compassion. The community shook their heads at her bad luck, never questioning why tragedy seemed to follow her wherever she went. By now, Linda had perfected her technique. The poison she used mimicked natural illness so convincingly that even experienced doctors saw nothing unusual. She knew how much to administer, when to increase the dosage, and how to appear as the devoted caregiver while death unfolded under her watch. Every prayer whispered at a bedside, every tear shed at a funeral, was part of her mask. The frightening reality was that Linda no longer needed financial motives to kill. Though money remained a driving force, murder had become a solution to any threat, whether it was discovery, suspicion, or inconvenience. Each death reinforced her confidence. Each successful deception deepened her belief that she was untouchable. Still, whispers began to circulate. Some neighbors remarked on the pattern of deaths around her. Others wondered how one woman could endure so much misfortune and still remain so composed. Yet no one dared voice accusations openly. To accuse a Christian woman, a mother, a caregiver, of cold-blooded murder seemed absurd. It was easier to accept coincidence than to confront the possibility of evil hiding in plain sight. By 1988, Linda was living a double life with frightening ease. By day, she was the saintly figure seen in church pews and hospital rooms, her Bible always near. By night, she was calculating doses, forging checks, and feeding her drug addiction with the money she stole. Her downfall, however, would not come from strangers or distant acquaintances. It would come from those closest to her, the very people she believed she could manipulate forever. The more Linda killed, the more her mask began to crack, and the more dangerous her lies became. For now, though she remained untouchable, her community still embraced her, doctors still misdiagnosed her victims, and families still praised her compassion. Evil had never worn such a convincing smile. But fate has a way of closing in, no matter how carefully the stage is set. And for Linda Johnson, the stage was about to collapse. By the end of the 1980s, Linda Johnson's story was beginning to resemble a script written by fate itself. To the casual observer, she was a woman burdened by grief, yet somehow unshaken in her devotion to faith and family. She had buried husbands, parents, and patients, yet still appeared in the front pew every Sunday with her Bible pressed against her chest. She spoke softly of God's will, of the trials that tested the faithful, and of her gratitude for the neighbors who supported her. Her words painted a portrait of a woman chosen by tragedy, yet carried by faith. But behind closed doors, Linda was sharpening her methods, weaving a web that grew larger with each victim who trusted her. Her drug habit was relentless. The small doses that had once calmed her nerves no longer worked. She chased stronger prescriptions, manipulated doctors for refills, and forged new identities to secure pills under false names. Each pill swallowed deepened her dependency, and each dependency demanded more money. Forgery, once a risky side activity, became her second nature. She studied signatures, timed transactions to avoid scrutiny, and moved money with a precision that spoke of years of practice. But even the most carefully built deceptions could not remain hidden forever. Her new relationship with a tobacco farmer named Charles Harris seemed different from the others. Unlike the elderly couples who had fallen under her care, Charles was only 56, strong, and respected in the community. He had lost his wife years earlier to illness and was searching for companionship more than financial gain. For Linda, he was not merely a source of money. He was a shield, a partner whose respectability could protect her image and silence any whispers of suspicion. Their courtship moved quickly. Linda was attentive, charming, and eager to provide the warmth Charles had been missing. They attended church together, hosted Sunday meals, and appeared the picture of stability. To the community, Charles and Linda were a match made in heaven. A hard-working farmer and a woman of faith who had endured more loss than most could imagine. But beneath the polished exterior, cracks were forming. Charles was attentive to his finances. He noticed when checks went missing or when withdrawals appeared without explanation. At first, he assumed it was oversight, perhaps a mistake at the bank or a misplaced payment. But as the irregularities grew, his questions became sharper. Linda responded with tears, prayers, and the practiced indignation of a woman accused unjustly. She assured him she would set things right, and Charles, unwilling to believe his partner capable of deceit, tried to dismiss his doubts. But doubt has a way of returning, stronger each time. By the winter of 1992, Charles had begun keeping his own records, comparing them to bank statements, and quietly consulting with his banker. The pattern was undeniable. Money was missing, checks had been forged, and Linda was at the center of it all. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Charles, normally calm, demanded answers, raising his voice in frustration as he laid the evidence before her. Linda wept, pleading that she was overwhelmed, that the stress of her life had driven her to mistakes. But Charles was not moved. He threatened to involve law enforcement, to end their relationship, and to expose her lies. For Linda, the threat was unbearable. Exposure meant the unraveling of everything she had built: her reputation, her finances, her mask of faith. It meant prison, disgrace, and the loss of the control she had clung to for decades. She had faced this kind of danger before, and she knew how to silence it. The following week, Charles accompanied Linda to a revival service in a packed church hall. Hundreds filled the pews, singing hymns as the preacher thundered about redemption and salvation. Linda sat beside Charles, her hand resting gently on his arm, her face serene. But inside, she had already set her plan in motion. Charles began to feel ill midway through the service. At first, it was mild queasiness he attributed to nerves after their heated argument. But the discomfort grew quickly into sharp cramps, forcing him to leave his seat and seek fresh air. Linda followed, hovering with concern, whispering prayers, and offering to take him home. To bystanders, she appeared the picture of compassion. No one suspected that she had already delivered the poison hours earlier, hidden in a meal or drink prepared with meticulous care. Back at his home, Charles's condition worsened rapidly. He collapsed into bed, his body racked with pain. Vomiting, dehydration, and chest pain followed, each symptom more violent than the last. Linda remained at his side, spooning broth into his mouth, adjusting his pillows, and whispering that God would see him through. She monitored his decline with the detachment of someone who had rehearsed the scene too many times to count. 3 days later, Charles was admitted to the hospital. Doctors were baffled by the suddenness and severity of his illness. They considered gastroenteritis, food poisoning, even cardiac issues, but none of the treatments brought relief. Charles deteriorated quickly, his organs failing one by one until death silenced him. The official diagnosis was complications from acute illness, a verdict that fit perfectly into Linda's pattern. But this time was different. Charles's family, unlike others before them, was not content with vague explanations. They knew of his suspicions, of the arguments he had had with Linda about missing money. They demanded a full autopsy, unwilling to accept another mysterious illness. The results were devastating. Traces of arsenic were found in Charles's system, in levels far beyond anything accidental. The poison had not come from spoiled food or contaminated water. It had been administered deliberately, and Linda was the only one with the access, opportunity, and history to do it. When investigators approached her, Linda at first denied everything. She wept, proclaimed her innocence, and leaned heavily on her identity as a God-fearing woman. But the evidence was too strong. Forged checks, financial records, testimonies from suspicious relatives all pointed to her. Slowly, the mask she had worn for decades began to crumble. Her arrest in 1992 sent shockwaves through the community. The woman they had trusted, the caregiver they had praised, was suddenly revealed as a killer who had hidden in plain sight. Families of former patients began to wonder, whispering about strange illnesses, sudden deaths, and the haunting realization that their loved ones may not have died naturally at all. Linda Johnson had woven her web with extraordinary care, using trust as her greatest weapon. But in the end, it was that very trust that doomed her. For years, no one had questioned her role at the center of so many tragedies. Once the questions began, however, they spread quickly, unraveling everything she had built. The woman who had betrayed and murdered those closest to her was finally exposed, not by chance, but by the persistence of a family unwilling to accept easy answers. And for Linda, the walls of her web were collapsing. The arrest of Linda Johnson in the fall of 1992 marked a turning point not only for her community, but also for the way investigators approached unexplained deaths in small-town America. For nearly 2 decades, she had moved like a shadow through the lives of her victims present at their deaths, mourned at their funerals, and praised for her unwavering devotion. But now the mask was slipping, and what lay beneath it was something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. When news spread that Linda had been taken into custody on suspicion of poisoning Charles Harris, disbelief swept through Amelia County. Neighbors who had once trusted her with their children now whispered about the pattern they had ignored for years. It can't be true, some insisted. She's a God-fearing woman. Others recalled the strange timing of her tragedies. Husbands who died unexpectedly, elderly patients who fell ill under her care, even her own mother's sudden decline. What had once been explained away as misfortune now looked like something else entirely, a chain of deliberate deaths, carefully concealed beneath a veil of prayer and compassion. Investigators quickly realized they were not dealing with an isolated crime. The discovery of arsenic in Charles Harris's body prompted them to revisit other suspicious deaths linked to Linda. Files that had long been closed were pulled from dusty cabinets, and conversations with doctors revealed a troubling pattern. The symptoms, violent stomach cramps, vomiting, dehydration, and rapid organ failure, appeared again and again, almost identical across different victims. Each time, Linda had been there. Each time, she had played the role of caregiver, the one person trusted above all others. Detectives from the Virginia State Bureau of Investigation began piecing together a timeline. A fire that had killed her first husband, Robert, back in 1969. The mysterious illness that claimed Edward Barnes only 2 years later. Her mother, Margaret, whose decline baffled her longtime physician. The elderly couples, the Edwards and the Lees, who died under her watch, their deaths attributed to age or natural illness. And finally, Charles Harris, whose suspicions had finally forced the truth into the open. Each case carried its own explanations, its own set of circumstances that seemed plausible in isolation. But together, they painted a chilling portrait. Linda Johnson was not a victim of misfortune. She was the architect of it. Under questioning, Linda's composure began to falter. At first, she maintained her innocence, insisting she was being framed, that her reputation as a Christian woman was being twisted into something monstrous. She wept during interrogations, asking detectives how they could believe she was capable of harming those she loved. But the more evidence they presented, bank records showing forgery, testimonies about her financial troubles, and medical reports linking symptoms across her victim, the weaker her denials became. Eventually, cracks began to show. In moments of exhaustion, she hinted that she had made mistakes, that her pill dependency had clouded her judgment. She claimed she only ever meant to make people sick, never to kill them, that the deaths were accidents caused by her miscalculations. Investigators were not convinced. The precision of the poisonings, the timing of the deaths, and the consistent financial benefit she gained from each victim suggested otherwise. This was not carelessness. It was calculation. As the investigation widened, the community's shock deepened into horror. Families who had once praised Linda now questioned whether their loved ones had been victims too. Old suspicions resurfaced, neighbors recalling valuables removed from houses before fires, or meals Linda had insisted on preparing just before someone fell ill. The very traits that had made her so trustworthy, her kindness, her faith, her eagerness to serve, were now reinterpreted as weapons. Meanwhile, Linda's life behind bars revealed a new dimension of her character. Stripped of her familiar roles, she sought to re-establish her image within prison walls. She led Bible studies, comforted anxious inmates, and wrote letters to pastors insisting she had found redemption. To some, this transformation seemed genuine. To others, it was yet another performance, a mask worn for survival. Her defense team began constructing a narrative to present in court. They argued that Linda was a woman broken by hardship, a victim of addiction and emotional strain. They pointed to her difficult childhood, her controlling father, and her years of sacrifice for family as factors that shaped her descent. They emphasized her pill dependency, suggesting that her judgment was impaired and her intent never murderous. It was a strategy designed to humanize her, to convince a jury that she was not evil, merely lost. The prosecution, however, prepared a case that stripped away every illusion. They focused on the pattern, the repeated use of arsenic, the financial motives, and the consistency of her victim's symptoms. They highlighted her history of forgery and theft, painting a picture of a woman who had long blended deception with violence. Most damning of all, They presented testimony from Charles Harris's relatives, who described his growing suspicions, his confrontations with Linda, and his determination to uncover the truth. His death, they argued, was not an accident of miscalculation, but a deliberate act to silence the one man who could expose her. The media seized on the story, dubbing Linda Johnson the Virginia poisoner and the woman who betrayed everyone. Who trusted her? Reporters crowded the courthouse, their stories filling newspapers with lurid details about the grandmotherly figure who had turned caregiving into murder. Television anchors spoke of the betrayal of trust, the chilling image of poison hidden in meals, and the unsettling reminder that evil could wear the gentlest face. For those who had known her personally, the revelations were devastating. Church. Members who had once embraced her now felt complicit in her mask. Families who had entrusted their loved ones to her care wrestled with guilt and rage. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, some struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the crime she was accused of. How could someone who prayed with them, who sang hymns beside them, be capable of such calculated cruelty? As her trial approached, Linda's world narrowed to the sterile walls of her prison cell and the haunting weight of the charges against her. But while the law now held her in its grasp, the larger question remained: how had she managed to kill for so long without anyone stopping her? The answer lay not only in her cunning, but in the very fabric of the community she inhabited. Trust had blinded them, faith had shielded her, and the reluctance to suspect evil in someone so ordinary had allowed her to operate with near impunity. The lesson was chilling. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers in the dark, but from those who sit beside us in the light, smiling, praying, and waiting for the moment to strike dot. And for Linda Johnson, that moment had come to an end. The stage she had carefully built for nearly 2 decades was about to collapse under. The weight of truth and the cracks in her mask would soon reveal the full face of betrayal. The courthouse in Amelia County had never seen such a spectacle. By the spring of 1993, when Linda Johnson finally stood before a jury of her peers, the case had become more than a local trial. It was a story that drew reporters from across Virginia and beyond, each eager to capture the shocking tale of a woman who had worn the mask of faith while hiding a string of murders beneath it. On the morning of the trial, spectators lined the hallways, whispering in disbelief as deputies escorted Linda into the courtroom. She wore a modest dress, her Bible tucked under her arm, her hair neatly combed. To the casual observer, she looked like any grandmother, calm and dignified. But those who had followed the case saw something else. They saw a predator disguised in humility, a woman accused of betraying everyone who had ever trusted her. The prosecution opened with a simple but devastating theme. Trust had been her weapon. They reminded the jury of Charles Harris, the man whose suspicions had set the investigation in motion. They described how he had noticed forged checks, how he had confronted her, and how he had fallen violently ill within days. His body, they explained, revealed the truth. Arsenic coursing through his system in lethal amounts. This was not an accident. This was murder. From there, the prosecutors widened their scope. They painted a chilling timeline that stretched back decades, connecting Linda to a series of deaths that had once been attributed to natural causes. Her first husband, Robert, killed in a suspicious fire. Her second husband, Edward, felled by sudden illness. Her mother, Margaret, who died with symptoms identical to those found in Charles Harris. And the elderly couples, the Edwards and the Lees, whose deaths had been dismissed as the cruelty of age. Each story was presented with precision. Each pattern highlighted until it became undeniable. Wherever Linda Johnson went, death followed. The defense countered with a portrait of Linda as a woman broken by life's hardships. They described her as a victim of abuse, addiction, and overwhelming responsibility. They spoke of her father's strict household, of her struggles with prescription pills, and of the crushing losses she had endured. Their argument was not that Linda was innocent, but that her actions were born of desperation rather than malice. They suggested that if she had poisoned Charles Harris, it was not out of cruelty, but out of a fractured mind clouded by drugs. Linda herself became the centerpiece of the trial. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice was soft, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She admitted to forgery, to stealing money to fund her addiction. She even admitted to making people sick, claiming that she never intended for anyone to die, that she had only wanted to keep her secrets hidden. But the jury heard more than excuses. They heard a woman carefully choosing her words, deflecting responsibility, and painting herself as a victim rather than the predator. The evidence suggested she was. The most haunting testimony came from medical experts. Doctors explained how arsenic poisoning mimicked natural illness, making it easy to misdiagnose. They detailed the way symptoms unfolded: cramping, vomiting, dehydration, organ failure, and showed how those same symptoms appeared in case after case tied to Linda. They described the presence of arsenic in Charles Harris's body, levels so high that no mistake could explain them. It was deliberate, precise, and deadly. Then came the families. Relatives of the Edwards, the Lees, and Margaret Johnson herself took the stand, their voices heavy with grief. They spoke of how much they had trusted Linda, how grateful they had been for her care, and how betrayed they now felt, knowing she had likely orchestrated their loved ones' deaths. Their words cut through the courtroom with a weight that no statistic or report could match. The media seized every detail. Headlines described her as the poisoned widow, the angel of death, and most chillingly, the woman who betrayed everyone who trusted her. Evening broadcasts carried footage of her walking into the courtroom, her Bible pressed to her chest, as commentators debated whether she was a cold-blooded killer or a woman crushed under the weight of addiction. Inside the courtroom, the evidence was difficult to dispute. Financial records showed her long history of forgery. Witnesses described her patterns of care and the illnesses that followed. Experts tied her victims together through the invisible thread of arsenic. And above all, Charles Harris's death served as the undeniable proof that could no longer be explained away. As the weeks dragged on, Linda's demeanor shifted. At first, she wept openly, her tears staining tissues as she listened to the charges. But as the evidence mounted, she grew colder, her face a mask of resignation. Some said she seemed almost relieved, as though the weight of decades of lies was finally too heavy to carry. Others saw it as calculation, the same careful detachment she had displayed while sitting at the bedsides of her victims. When the closing arguments came, the prosecution did not hold back. They spoke of betrayal, of a woman who had turned trust into a weapon and faith into a shield. They reminded the jury that Linda was not accused of a single lapse in judgment, but of a pattern of deliberate, calculated murders. This was not a mistake, they declared. This was a choice repeated again and again until no one around her was safe. The defense urged mercy. They reminded the jury of her struggles, her drug dependency, and her supposed lack of intent to kill. They painted her as a tragic figure rather than a monster, a woman consumed by her own demons rather than one who thrived on the suffering of others. The jury deliberated for days, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Outside, crowds gathered, waiting for the verdict that would determine the fate of the woman who had haunted their community for decades. When at last the foreman rose and read the words guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and sorrow. Linda Johnson stood silently as the verdict was delivered, her Bible clutched tightly in her hands. She showed no tears this time, no outward sign of despair. She only nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a truth she had long known would come. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole, a punishment that ensured she would never again sit at the bedside of another victim. For the families, it was justice, though incomplete. No verdict could bring back their loved ones. No sentence could erase the years of grief and betrayal. But at least the mask had been torn away. At least the woman who had hidden in plain sight was finally exposed. As deputies led her away, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the whispers of the crowd followed her out of the courtroom. The grandmotherly figure once praised for her compassion was gone. What remained was a convicted murderer, forever remembered not for the kindness she pretended to embody, but for the poison she carried in her hands and the betrayal she left in her wake. Life behind bars was supposed to strip Linda Johnson of everything she had once used to deceive: her freedom, her access to victims, her image as a caregiver. Yet prison became another stage for her performance, another environment where she could reinvent herself and weave new versions of her story. To the outside world, she was a convicted murderer. But inside those walls, Linda tried to cast herself in a different role: the prophet, the redeemed woman who had finally found salvation. From the first week of her sentence, Linda attached herself to the prison chapel. She volunteered for Bible readings, joined every study group, and quickly became known among inmates as someone deeply devoted to faith. Guards noticed how she carried her Bible everywhere, underlining verses, speaking softly to younger women about repentance and grace. For those unfamiliar with her history, she seemed almost saintly, an older woman offering wisdom in a place starved of kindness. But not everyone was convinced. Some inmates whispered that her behavior was just another act, the same mask she had worn for years in Amelia County. They had seen women like her before, those who turned religion into a performance, hoping to soften their image in the eyes of guards or parole boards. Yet Linda persisted, carefully cultivating her role as a spiritual guide. Letters she wrote from prison revealed another layer of her transformation. She reached out to pastors, to journalists, even to family members, insisting she had been misunderstood. She admitted to making mistakes, but framed them as the sins of a broken woman who had now found redemption. She quoted scripture liberally, promising that she had turned her heart to God and that her suffering was part of a divine plan. Some believed her. Others saw it as manipulation dressed in scripture. What troubled investigators and victims' families most was not that she sought forgiveness, but that she never truly confessed. Even after conviction, Linda avoided admitting her full role in the deaths. She spoke vaguely of causing harm, of not being herself under the influence of pills. But never once did she acknowledge the deliberate choices that had cost so many lives. It was as if she wanted to be seen as both guilty and innocent, responsible enough to be tragic, but not so responsible that she was monstrous. Within prison, her influence grew. Younger inmates gravitated toward her, asking for advice or comfort. She spoke about perseverance, about holding on to hope, even when the world had turned against them. To them, she was a grandmotherly figure, someone who could soften the harshness of prison life. The irony was striking. The same traits she had once used to lure victims into trust were now helping her build authority behind bars. Journalists who visited her reported conflicting impressions. Some left convinced they had spoken with a woman genuinely transformed, her eyes brimming with regret, her voice trembling as she spoke about God's mercy. Others left unsettled, describing her as evasive, always shifting blame onto addiction, fate, or misunderstood intentions. One writer noted that Linda seemed less interested in seeking forgiveness from those she had hurt and more interested in convincing the world she was not as bad as the evidence had shown. Outside the prison walls, families of the victims wrestled with her attempts at reinvention. To them, every letter, every interview was another betrayal. She had stolen their loved ones with poison and deceit, and now she sought to steal sympathy as well. For them, there could be no redemption without truth, and truth was something Linda never fully gave. Despite her life sentence, rumors spread that she hoped for parole one day. The possibility horrified the community. Letters poured into the governor's office, demanding she remain behind bars until her last breath. No one wanted to risk seeing Linda Johnson free again, her mask polished and ready for another stage. Prison changed her in ways even she could not control. Removed from the rhythms of small-town life, Linda no longer had the power to dictate her surroundings. She was one among hundreds, her movements monitored, her choices limited. For a woman who had spent years manipulating others, the loss of control was a kind of punishment in itself. Still, she adapted, turning even that into part of her narrative. She spoke of humility, of learning to surrender, of letting God's will shape her days. But her health began to decline in the years that followed. The same pills that had fueled her addictions and crimes had also taken a toll on her body. Her organs weakened, and chronic pain followed her into old age. Prison. Doctors treated her ailments, but nothing could reverse the damage. Some saw her suffering as just a slow, drawn-out consequence for the pain she had inflicted on others. Others pitied her, unable to reconcile the frail old woman in a prison infirmary with the calculating poisoner of decades past. By the mid-1990s, Linda's name had faded from the headlines. New scandals, new crimes, and new trials replaced her in the public eye. But within the prison walls, her legend remained. Some inmates swore she was a changed woman, their prison prophet. Others dismissed her as a manipulator who had simply adapted her mask to a new stage. The truth, as always with Linda, was difficult to pin down. She had lived her entire life behind a shifting set of masks: grieving widow, devoted daughter, compassionate caregiver, and now redeemed prisoner. Each role was convincing enough to draw people in, yet each concealed the same cold calculation beneath it. What made her story so haunting was not just the number of lives she had taken, but the way she had done it. Her weapon was never a knife in the dark or a gun in the night. It was trust, carefully cultivated and fatally exploited. That weapon had been taken from her now, but the memory of it lingered like a poison in the hearts of those who had once believed in her. In the quiet of her cell, Linda Johnson read scripture aloud, her voice echoing off the walls. She spoke of grace and redemption, of the promise of eternal life. But outside those walls, the families she had destroyed could not forget. For them, redemption meant nothing without confession, and confession was something Linda would never give. And so, she lived out her days in contradiction, praised by some as a figure of spiritual rebirth, reviled by others as a predator who had never faced the full truth of her actions. The woman who betrayed everyone who trusted her had found a new stage, but her audience was no longer willing to believe. The performance. The conviction of Linda Johnson had closed a chapter, but the story she left behind continued to shape the lives of everyone who had been touched by her crimes. For Amelia County, her trial was not just another case in the courtroom. It was a wound that never fully healed. Years later, the mention of her name still carried a hush, as if speaking it aloud risked summoning the specter of betrayal she had cast over the town. Families of her victims struggled most with the aftermath. For them, the verdict offered justice. But justice felt hollow. The graves of their loved ones remained, reminders of the trust they had given to a woman who used it as a weapon. Many wrestled with guilt, questioning how they could have been so blind. Some replayed moments when doubts had crossed their minds. A meal Linda insisted on preparing, a prescription she controlled, a sudden illness that never made sense. They wondered whether they could have stopped her, whether their silence had enabled her cruelty. For children who had lost parents, the betrayal was even deeper. Linda had not been a stranger, not a nameless danger lurking in the dark. She had been family, friend, or neighbor. The lesson they learned was one of distrust, a painful awareness that evil sometimes wore the face of kindness. Those children grew into adults who struggled to trust easily, their worldview forever shaped by the quiet poison Linda had administered not only to bodies, but to the very fabric of faith in others. The case also left its mark on medicine. Doctors, who had once dismissed symptoms as ordinary, now faced sharp questions about their oversight. How had so many cases of arsenic poisoning been missed? How had natural causes been written on death certificates again and again when the signs had been there all along? The truth was uncomfortable. No one had expected a woman like Linda Johnson to be capable of murder. Gender, age, and reputation had worked as shields. In the world of the early 1990s, suspicion rarely fell on women, especially those who embodied the role of caregiver. Her case forced a reevaluation, a recognition that trust could no longer replace vigilance. The legal system, too, absorbed the lessons of Linda's betrayals. Investigators began treating unexplained deaths with more caution, especially in cases where one individual was consistently present. Autopsies became more common, toxicology testing more thorough. The idea that a kindly caregiver might also be a killer no longer seemed unthinkable. Linda Johnson's name, whispered in seminars and conferences, became shorthand for the hidden dangers of unquestioned trust. But while institutions adapted, individuals struggled with scars that could not be erased. Church members who had once prayed beside Linda described feelings of shame. They remembered offering her condolences, praising her strength, and lifting her in prayer as tragedy seemed to strike her again and again. Now they realized they had been mourning victims of her own making. Their faith was shaken, not only in her, but in themselves, in their ability to see truth behind masks. For some, it led to deeper suspicion, even cynicism. For others, it was a call to be more discerning, to recognize that faith and vigilance must walk hand in hand. The media kept her story alive, sometimes in ways that sensationalized her crimes. Documentaries and true crime programs cast her as the poison widow, the grandmother killer, or the woman who betrayed everyone who trusted her. Each retelling highlighted the strangeness of her dual identity, a woman who spoke of God and family, even as she plotted death in kitchens and bedrooms. These portrayals cemented her place in the darker side of American crime history, alongside other figures who had blurred the line between compassion and cruelty. Yet beneath the sensationalism lay a deeper truth about human vulnerability. Linda Johnson's power came not from force, but from trust. Her victims invited her into their lives, welcomed her into their homes, and believed in the image she projected. They trusted her to cook meals, to dispense medicine, to offer comfort. It was this trust that became her greatest weapon, one that no lock or key could defend against. That lesson lingered long after her trial, shaping the way communities thought about caregiving, dependence, and the blind spots of human faith. Inside prison, Linda remained a subject of fascination. Journalists wrote about her religious devotion, her attempts to present herself as a redeemed woman. Some saw her as proof of the human capacity for transformation. Others dismissed her as a manipulator continuing her lifelong performance. To many, her behavior behind bars only deepened the unease. Even when stripped of freedom, she managed to wield influence, to draw people toward her, to shape the narrative of who she was. But outside, her victims' families pushed back against that narrative. They wrote letters to editors, reminding the public of the lives lost, the families shattered. They insisted that Linda's story was not one of redemption, but of destruction. They wanted her remembered not as a tragic figure, but as a murderer who had preyed on those who trusted her most. And still, questions lingered. How many victims had there truly been? The trial had focused on Charles Harris and drawn connections to others, but suspicions stretched further. Neighbors whispered about illnesses never investigated, about deaths too quickly buried. Without autopsies, many cases would never be resolved. The true scale of Linda's betrayal might never be known. That uncertainty haunted the community, leaving open wounds that time could not close. The broader legacy of Linda Johnson was not written in court transcripts or media headlines. It lived in the quiet changes she forced upon those around her. Families became more cautious, doctors more skeptical, communities more aware of the dangers of blind trust. Her story was a chilling reminder that evil often disguises itself, not in menace, but in familiarity. As the years passed, her name faded from everyday conversation, but the lessons remained etched in memory. To speak of Linda Johnson was to speak of betrayal, of the fragility of trust, and of the danger that lurks when kindness is used as camouflage. The woman who betrayed everyone who trusted her had left behind more than a trail of victims. She had left behind a cautionary tale, one that continued to echo in whispers long after the prison gates closed on her life. By the late 1990s, Linda Johnson's life had narrowed to the routines of prison. The woman who once moved freely through kitchens, church pews, and hospital rooms now shuffled down echoing corridors under the watch of guards. Her world was measured by meal times, count times, and chapel services. But even within these confines, her name carried weight. To some inmates, she was a grandmotherly presence. To others, a reminder of how dangerous kindness could be. Time was not kind to Linda. Years of pill dependency, stress, and hidden guilt had left deep marks on her body. She suffered from chronic illnesses, liver problems, heart complications, and the constant ache of arthritis. Doctors prescribed treatments, but there was little they could undo. Each passing year left her weaker, less capable of projecting the confident image she had once used to command trust. The vibrant, calculating woman of Amelia County was giving way to a frail figure hunched in the prison infirmary. Yet even in her decline, Linda continued to perform. She clung to the role of the devout believer, reading scripture aloud in her cell, offering comfort to younger inmates, and speaking of forgiveness as though she had fully embraced it. Guards noticed her calm demeanor, how she rarely caused trouble, how she seemed to accept her fate with grace. To an outsider, she looked like a woman transformed. But to those who remembered her crimes, it was impossible not to see echoes of the same performance. She had given at hospital bedsides and funeral altars. Her health struggles brought occasional trips to outside hospitals. Each time, the media revived her story, reminding the public that one of Virginia's most notorious murderers was still alive, still preaching, still shaping perceptions. These reports rekindled anger among victims' families. For them, her frailty did not erase her past. No matter how many tubes or monitors surrounded her, they could not forget that she had once watched others suffer in similar conditions only. She had caused their pain. The possibility of parole was raised once or twice, as procedures required it to be considered even for life sentences. Each time, the very suggestion was met with a storm of opposition. Families wrote letters pleading with the parole board to deny her release. Community members signed petitions. Even lawmakers spoke publicly, warning that to free Linda Johnson would be to reopen old wounds and betray justice itself. The board agreed, and her requests were swiftly rejected. Linda would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Inside prison, Linda's days grew quieter. She could no longer lead Bible studies with the same energy, nor could she write long letters as she once had. Instead, she spent hours reflecting, staring at faded photographs or the thin pages of her well-worn Bible. Inmates described her as withdrawn, sometimes lost in thought, sometimes whispering prayers under her breath. A few claimed she spoke of her past, not with confession, but with carefully chosen words always vague, always sidestepping the full truth. Her decline stirred complicated emotions among those who followed her story. Some saw her suffering as a form of poetic justice, the slow erosion of a body that had once carried out so much harm. Others saw her as pitiable, a reminder that time reduces even the most feared figures to fragility. For the families of her victims, however, pity was hard to muster. They had watched their loved ones die in agony, poisoned by trust. Linda's frailty was nothing compared to the torment she had inflicted Dot by the early 2000s. Linda's health was failing rapidly. The prison infirmary became her permanent home, a sterile world of metal frames and white walls. Nurses tended to her daily, but many carried the knowledge of who she was and what she had done. To them, she was both a patient and a warning, a reminder that evil could wear a gentle smile. They treated her symptoms, but they did not forget her legacy. Dot as death approached. Linda maintained her outward persona of faith. She spoke of heaven, of forgiveness, of her belief that God would receive her. Yet she never made the kind of confession that families longed for. No clear acknowledgement of guilt, no detailed apology for the lives she had stolen. Only half admissions, vague references to mistakes, and the repeated claim that she had been broken by addiction. For many, it felt like one last betrayal, refusal to give truth in her final days. Outside prison walls, her story began to fade from headlines, but it remained alive in whispers. True crime writers revisited her case, exploring the chilling paradox of a caregiver-turned-killer. Documentaries replayed the details, drawing new audiences into the mystery of how she had evaded suspicion for so long. To the broader world, she became part of a grim catalog of figures who had blurred the boundaries between compassion and cruelty. But for Amelia County, her memory remained personal. The town still carried the scars of her betrayals. Churches remembered the hymns she once sang. Neighbors remembered the funerals she attended. Families remembered the meals she cooked that became their loved ones' last. The poison she left behind was not only chemical, it was emotional, spiritual, and communal. By the time Linda Johnson drew her final breaths in the prison infirmary, she was a shadow of the woman who had once moved so confidently through her community. The strong, calculating figure was gone, replaced by a frail body worn down by years of confinement and guilt. Whether she truly believed in the redemption she spoke of, or whether it was just another mask she wore to the very end, no one could say for certain. Her death brought mixed feelings. Some felt relief that her story was finally closed. Others felt frustration, knowing that she had left behind unanswered questions, unacknowledged crimes, and families who would never receive the truth they deserved. In the end, Linda Johnson left the world much as she had lived in it, cloaked in contradiction, a figure of faith and betrayal, kindness and cruelty, humanity and monstrosity. Her legacy remained not in her words, but in her actions. She was remembered as the woman who had turned trust into poison, who had made caregiving a mask for murder, who had betrayed everyone who believed in her. And even as her name faded into history, the lesson of her life lingered. Trust is a fragile thing, and when placed in the wrong hands, it can become the most dangerous weapon of all. When Linda Johnson died behind prison walls, many believed her story would finally be over. The iron gates closed on her life, the headlines faded, and her frail body was laid to rest without the fanfare she had once commanded in courtrooms and newspapers. Yet her shadow did not vanish with her. In Amelia County, and far beyond it, the story of the woman who betrayed everyone who trusted her continued to echo. For the families of her victims, her death brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some felt relief that she could no longer shape her narrative, no longer present herself as the pious grandmother who had simply made mistakes. Others felt bitterness, anger that she had gone to the grave without a full confession, without naming the true number of her victims, without granting them the closure they had waited for. For them, Linda's final betrayal was silenced out in Amelia County. A memory of her crimes reshaped the way people thought about trust. Neighbors no longer saw caregiving through the same lens of unquestioned faith. Families became more cautious about who they welcomed into their homes, who they allowed to prepare their meals, who they relied on during times of illness. Linda's legacy was not only the deaths she caused, but the permanent shift in how trust was understood in small communities. Churches, too, wrestled with her story. For years, Linda had been a fixture of Sunday services, her hymns rising alongside those of her neighbors. She had spoken of faith, offered prayers, and presented herself as a servant of God. To learn that she had carried arsenic in her hands while lifting scripture with her voice shook congregations deeply. Pastors spoke of discernment, of the danger, of mistaking outward appearances for true faith. Linda's name became an example in sermons, a warning that even those who appear righteous can harbor darkness. The medical community did not forget her either. Her case was cited in seminars, textbooks, and conferences as an example of how easily poison could mimic natural illness. Doctors were urged to remain vigilant, to order toxicology tests when symptoms did not align with common explanations. Linda Johnson became a case study, her betrayals fueling a new era of medical caution. In law enforcement, her trial was remembered as a lesson in persistence. Detectives who had once dismissed suspicions as paranoia now saw the importance of connecting patterns, of refusing to accept coincidence when death followed the same figure again and again. The phrase "hidden in plain sight" became a chilling reminder of her ability to cloak cruelty and familiarity. But beyond the institutions, it was ordinary people who carried her story the longest. Parents warned children not to trust blindly. Friends hesitated before accepting help too quickly. The quiet knowledge that betrayal could come not from strangers, but from those closest to you, settled into the bones of the community. It was not paranoia, it was survival, born of hard lessons carved by Linda's hands. True crime writers and documentarians ensured her name did not fade completely. Programs retold her story, often with dramatic titles: The Poisoned Widow of Virginia, The Angel of Death, The Woman Who Betrayed Everyone Who Trusted Her. Each version emphasized the strangeness of her dual identity: nurturer and killer, caregiver and predator. She became part of a grim archive of American history, one of the figures whose lives served less as biography and more as warning. And yet, there was something different about Linda Johnson compared to others in that archive. Many killers were driven by rage, impulse, or cruelty that showed itself openly. Linda's weapon was subtler, more insidious. She did not strike in the dark. She waited in the light, offering comfort, serving meals, whispering prayers. Her poison was not only chemical, but emotional: the betrayal of trust, the destruction of faith in kindness itself. That was what made her story endure, even years after her death. Former neighbors remembered her with unease. Some recalled sitting across from her at church suppers, eating food she had prepared, now shuddering at what might have been hidden in the taste. Others remembered her hugs at funerals, her words of sympathy, her presence at moments of grief. Looking back, they realized she had always been there, at the center of tragedy, quietly weaving herself into the narrative of suffering she had caused. The younger generation, those who had not lived through the trial, heard her story as legend. To them, Linda Johnson was a cautionary tale passed down in hushed tones, proof that evil could hide behind the softest smile. Her story became part of the local identity of Amelia County, a reminder of the dangers that once lived among them. What made her story so enduring was not only the scale of her crimes, but the questions she left unanswered. How many victims were there truly? Did she ever feel remorse? Was her devotion in prison genuine, or just another mask? No one could answer with certainty. And in that uncertainty, her shadow grew larger. For scholars of crime and psychology, Linda Johnson embodied the paradox of human nature, the ability to project compassion while committing cruelty, to live as both nurturer and destroyer. Her life was studied not just for the facts of her murders, but for what it revealed about human deception, about the masks people wear, about the ease with which trust can be exploited. Her story ended in a prison infirmary, but the lessons of her life did not. They lived on in families who carried scars, in institutions that adjusted their practices, in communities that learned to question appearances. She had poisoned bodies, but she had also poisoned certainty itself, leaving behind a world less trusting, less naive, more cautious. And so, Linda Johnson remained what she had always been, a paradox. To some, a redeemed woman who found God in her final years. To others, a monster who never admitted the full truth. To history, she was both a grandmotherly figure whose soft voice hid a predator's will, a woman who turned trust into her deadliest weapon. The final verdict on her life was not written in a courtroom, but in the lasting unease she left behind. She was proof that betrayal cuts deeper than violence, that poison spreads beyond the body, that trust once broken can echo through generations. Linda Johnson was gone, but the shadow of her betrayal lingered. A warning, a lesson, a story never to be forgotten. The woman who betrayed and murdered everyone who trusted her had left this world, but her story lived on as a haunting reminder that the greatest dangers often come not from strangers, but from the very people we welcome into our hearts.